And here is one element that is recent in the Arab world, I would say 15 years old, but became now much more prominent than before. In addition to all the problems of the Arab world, there is also hopelessness. In the last 15 years, there is a recognition in the Arab world, very widespread, and a subject of fascinating discussion among Arab elites, that the Arab world is perhaps the most outstanding failure of the recent era. And this understanding, by the way, you're not supposed to speak about it in politically correct universities in the United States, Europe, and Israel, but in the Arab world, this is a subject for discussion that is pluralistic to an extent that is unbelievable. And there are elites in the Arab world who understand it very well. There are elites in the Arab world who would want to do what they know is necessary in order to change it, but unfortunately, their position in their own society, their weight in their own society is such that they cannot do it. To give you a personal example, I recently approached a friend of mine and I said to him, Sadadin, every time I meet you, it warms my heart. And he responded, don't misunderstand what's happening in the Arab world. People like me are not marginal. We are negligible. The problem is that very impressive Arabs who understand it very, very well are not in a position to change their societies. And a society that is hopeless about itself also produces something that from an Israeli point of view is very dangerous. We see early signs of it, but I'm sorry to say I think it's deeper than the signs we see. A perception of saying, we cannot offer a better life to our children, let us at least ruin the lives of your children. We cannot find hope for ourselves, so in this ocean of failure, when there is an island of success, it is something that we cannot live with, even more than with the question of a Jewish state in the middle of the Arab world. So there is an additional element here. I'm not saying this is the essence of the problem that we're having, but it's an additional element that we have recently. So, to sum it up, things in the region are not good, they're not getting any better, and you have to get accustomed to living in an area that is not only today unstable, with a deep perception of hopelessness, but will probably be like that for the foreseeable future. Let's go to the international scene, and there we see 2.5 negative elements and 1 positive that I will discuss later. First of all, international organizations. Israel's situation in international organizations is nothing short of hopeless and catastrophic. Most international organizations, particularly those associated with the United Nations, deal very often 2/3 of their time with condemning Israel, with countries like Sudan, Syria, Cuba, and Libya condemning Israel for not having human rights on the standards desired by the illustrious standards of these countries. And again, this is not something that will change. It is only getting worse. It is structural. You have in the United Nations 22 Arab states, 57 Muslim states, 123 third world states. If you want to get anywhere in the United Nations, you must have these countries on your side. And so not only do you have a profoundly hostile attitude, regardless of Israeli policies, in the United Nations, but also countries who are basically friendly to Israel and have excellent relations on the bilateral level, very often even intimate relations on the bilateral level, will vote in the United Nations, in international organizations, against Israel, and again, not just voting against Israel, but making Israel bashing the major raison d'etre of these organizations. And again, this is only getting worse every year because the Europeans have joined it. Right? And public opinion is going further and further away from Israel. Just to give you an example, in different public opinion polls in Germany, between 30 and 40% of Germans would say today that Israel is conducting vis-à-vis the Palestinians a Vernichtungskrieg, the term the Nazis have used about the extermination of the Jews. Between 30 and 40% believe that we have been doing this to the Palestinians, namely Israel is doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis have done to the Jews. And when you see what is happening in Europe, again, the problem is structural. First of all, what you have in Europe is a perception, a Disneyland perception, if I may characterize it, that the use of force is no longer necessary in this new world. You can have a dialogue. And I'm sure the Israelis here will recognize the Shaike Ophir distinction between dialogue and monologue. You remember it? Whereas in the case of monologue, there is one person talking to himself. In the case of dialogue, two persons are talking to themselves. Okay? And the main problem is structural. The idea that Israel does not conform with what the Europeans believe to be the New World Order, that Israel does not want to become part of the Middle East the way individual European countries want to become part of Europe, is something that is very difficult for Europeans to digest. Add to this very strong anti-Semitic elements in Europe, and you will find that the problem with Europe is structural. Now, Europe is also doing something very negative because when you have in international organizations the worst repulsive slander by barbarians against Israel, the Europeans abstain from voting. So the idea that because this represents the international community, and in order to be part of the international community, the Europeans have to play ball in the United Nations. And in the United Nations, when you have the kind of resolutions you have, not only in the General Assembly, but even in The Hague, when it comes to so-called judicial issues, somebody wants, I'm willing to give examples later, is something that is structural and will not change. The half bad news is about the United States. And it is the fact that regardless of what you think of American policy in the Middle East, say it is superb, the one thing that you can say objectively is that every enemy of the United States is delighted with the Obama administration, and everyone in the Middle East that wants to work with the United States is concerned, if not frightened, by the American policy. Okay? So that's an objective assessment of people in the region. And a weak America, as perceived in the Middle East, is bad for Israel. And is very problematic in addition to the other problems we have on the international level. I will come later to the part of the United States that is on the positive side, but let me just say one last thing about a challenge that we have domestically in Israel. Actually, it is a negative byproduct of a very positive phenomenon. The positive phenomenon is that Israelis are congregating in the middle of the political spectrum. We have in Israel about 2/3 of the population in the middle of the political spectrum, with a relatively small deep left and a relatively small deep right. Now, to me, this is one of the best things you can say about a society. But what happens to the deep left and the deep right, being outraged by the fact that the overwhelming majority of Israelis have deserted them, they are hysteric in their response to it. For the deep right, everybody is a traitor. And Netanyahu is a leftist. And everybody wants to betray the land of Israel and give it to its enemies. For the deep left, Israel is fascist and Israel is apartheidist. And recently, Haaretz came up with a new thing that I must admit, even my vivid imagination didn't come up with. Israel treats the Palestinians like slaves. I mean, actually, what we have is modern slavery. And both sides need to be more and more radical every week just to keep the attention and to feed each other. Because the fear of the extreme right feeds the deep left, and the fear of the deep left feeds the extreme right. So in a way, they have a common interest in getting things out of the very wide consensus that you have in Israel. And the perception is we need to save Israel from the others. I mean, the deep right needs to save Israel from what they perceive to be as the leftist takeover, and the deep left feels that it has to save Israel from what they perceive being the right-wing takeover. And that's a very serious challenge on the domestic scene. Let me come now to the not so bad news. I mean, usually you have good news and bad news, right? But we're speaking about Jews, so we have bad news and not so bad news. I wish I had something like this great story about Brezhnev's Russia, where somebody comes to the Komsomol and says, comrades, I have bad news and good news. First, the bad news, the Chinese have landed on the moon. Now the good news, all of them. I have nothing that is similar to that can turn. There are quite a lot of not so bad news. First of all, if the Arab world is disintegrating, then in the near future, there is no conventional threat to the existence of the State of Israel. Okay? There is the Iranian nuclear threat, but a conventional threat, which is much more realistic, is not there anymore. Good product, good byproduct of a basically bad thing. Another good thing, actually, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Georgia, the United States, and Israel have identical interests in the Middle East. One day the United States will recognize it. But I'm delighted to say that the Egyptians recognize it, and they're working very, very closely with Israel. And Saudi Arabia recognizes it, and some people may say that perhaps clandestinely they are willing to work with Israel. But the fact of the matter is that there is a common interest of very important countries because they have a common enemy, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the common concern that the United States is weak and pursuing a misguided policy in the region, or has no policy in the region. That's also good. Syria, as a state, our most prominent immediate enemy, is no more. There is no Syria. Now again, whatever comes out in Syria will be bad. There can't be anything but terrible as an outcome of this civil war. But as long as the civil war is there, the threat from Syria is very, very low. It can be a misunderstanding or something on a minor scale, but not a major conventional threat as we used to have. Hezbollah is weak because of the Syrian civil war. Hamas is very much weakened because the Egyptian regime recognizes that it is more dangerous to Cairo than it is to Jerusalem. Erdogan's Turkey. Here I find a lot of misunderstanding in Washington about Turkey. I believe that Erdogan is perhaps one of the most dangerous enemies of the United States and Israeli interests in the region, but I'm delighted to say Erdogan failed in everything he touched. And he's today isolated with Hamas. I mean, this is his only real ally in the region, because they've cut diplomatic relations between Egypt and Turkey. In Syria, the people he would have supported, namely the Muslim Brothers, are in bad shape. In Jordan, that would have fallen had, God forbid, the Muslim Brothers succeeded in Turkey, in Syria, with Turkish support. This would have strengthened the Hamas in Jordan, and Hamas had a good chance of taking over Jordan. This did not happen because of the failure, the regional failure of Hamas. The Hamas in Jordan is not encouraged, is discouraged. So the failure of Turkey, of Erdogan's Turkey, I mean, Turkey may come back to be what it used to be for the United States and for Israel after Erdogan and Davutoglu. But Turkey, this Turkey, Erdogan's Turkey, is now in very, very bad shape in terms of its regional position, and I think that's a very positive thing for Israel. And something that I've already mentioned, but let me mention it again, the Muslim Brothers have been very much weakened throughout the Arab world, and that in itself is a very good sign from the Israeli point of view. What we have in the region increasing is missile and rocket threats, but Israel can deal with it more effectively than any other country. For instance, Israel is the only country in the world that has a complete coverage against ballistic missiles. Now, does it mean that no single ballistic missile can get through? No, it can get through. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it's better than anybody has ever had anywhere. So in comparative terms, we're in a relatively good situation. Let's come to the global level. The United Nations is a major nuisance, and here and there can be a danger, but in a real way, compared to other dangers, we can live with the hostility of the United Nations for a long time to come. Again, it can have new elements like the International Criminal Court that is very dangerous, but in the long run, this is something you can live with. And because a very large portion of the countries that votes against us in the United Nations have excellent and even intimate relations with Israel, then, you can live with it. Europe is a very major problem on the cultural level because it is insulting to Israel that the people who should be with Israel are against Israel very often. But in Europe, we have a problem but no dilemma. Here is the interesting distinction between the two. Even when Europeans can cause Israel a lot of harm, and recently they're trying to demonstrate that they can in order not to be disregarded, and it makes them happy. When it comes to a dilemma, there is no dilemma because what the Europeans want us to do, we can't consider doing anyhow. If, God forbid, we would have listened to the Europeans, we would not have knocked out the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and Saddam Hussein would have had a nuclear weapon. We would not have knocked out the Syrian nuclear project, and imagine the current civil war when you have an advanced nuclear program with the chaos that you have now in Syria. If we would have listened to the Europeans, then a decade ago, when life in Israel was impossible because of terrorism of the kind that democratic societies have never witnessed, we would not have taken the Operation Defensive Wall in 2002 that changed dramatically and brought terrorism down 98%. I mean, living in Israel would have been impossible if we would have listened to the Europeans, namely having a dialogue with Arafat about terrorism. So there is no dilemma. When the Europeans, for instance, say, freeze the settlements or else, they don't just mean the settlements in the parts that will probably go to a Palestinian state once it is established. They also mean East Jerusalem, they also mean the Golan Heights, they also mean something that no government in Israel, even if it is a left-leaning government, will be able to listen, because they're purists. And when you look at what Europeans are doing inside Israel, when European governments and European parties who get their money from governments finance organizations who say that Israel has no right to exist as a Jewish state and should be substituted by a state with an Arab majority after the right of return will be exercised, this is something that will not end. So there is no dilemma. There is a serious problem, but no dilemma. But here is the most positive element. And this is the position of Israel in the United States. I must say I'm pinching myself again and again just to believe that this is happening, because something between 64 to 75%, depending on how you measure it, of people in the United States have a very positive attitude vis-a-vis Israel. And this is reflected in Congress, and this is reflected by the fact that every American administration, including very critical vis-a-vis Israel, including one administration that was very distinctly unfriendly to Israel, I mean Jimmy Carter's administration, in all the time of all administrations, Israeli-American relations are constantly getting better. If you look at what we are having since the 1960s until today, when you have more critical or less critical, more friendly or less friendly, even one unfriendly administration, no matter what the administration, the relations between Israel and the United States constantly get better, because you have a combination of a similar ethos and also something that very few people realize to the full extent. Israel may be the only country, and if not the only, I doubt if there are more than 2 or 3 others, that have the combination of strong, stable, responsible, pro-American, and determined. This is a very unique combination. So when, as I hope, the United States leaves the Middle East for China, as they should, the Middle East will remain with 3 countries that the United States can work with: Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Okay, Jordan, but I mean 3 major countries that the United States can work with. So I would think that whatever global decisions the United States will take will be very helpful for Israel. Let me turn now to the last point, and this is what is happening in the Israeli society. I spoke before of the minor negative byproduct of the very positive trend in Israeli society. Living under extreme pressure, Israelis congregate to the middle. This is the best thing you can say about the Israeli society. But there are 2 other things, because when you speak about resilience, when you speak about a long conflict, when you speak about a never-ending conflict, the kind the United States is now beginning to learn that it also has to wage. The most important part is the resilience of the Israeli population. My center at the Haifa University conducts now for 14 years the most extensive and most systematic research about Israeli resilience. And the good news is that it's on a very high level with very small fluctuations going up and down. And if you look at the objective elements and the subjective elements of it, you can be very encouraged. Now, concerning the objective elements, there can be some disagreement. And there are two universes. One is the universe of Israel, and the other universe is of the Haaretz newspaper. And you have to make a decision what you're willing to believe. But the important thing is, before I come to the objective part, let's discuss the subjective part. You ask Israelis in the largest public opinion poll in Israel. You know, the usual public opinion polls in Israel are 508 people. They represent, if they're well organized, they represent all sections of Israel, and they all agree, the statisticians and the sociologists, that it is a representative sample of Israel, 508 people. But we have one public opinion poll that takes 33,500 people, done by the Central Bureau of Statistics once a year. And they asked them two questions, and the tension between the two is fascinating. The first is, what do you think the situation of Israel is? And then Israelis say, it's terrible. Everything is collapsing. The democracy is no more, and the economy is collapsing, and everything is terrible. And then they ask people, how is your life? And they say, it's great. It's greater than ever before. And we expect it to be much better next year. And this is what counts, because the first element has to do with the genetic defect of the Jewish people. A Jew cannot feel good unless he feels bad. I mean, I don't know how many Jews are here. Just look at yourself and you will see. If you don't feel bad, you don't feel really good. So Israelis need to say something bad about themselves, otherwise they don't feel good about themselves. But then, what they say about their life and the way they act about their life, namely, that only 2 per mil of the Israelis are leaving Israel, which is the second lowest among the OECD countries. Now, if you look at the newspapers, all of Israel has already moved to Berlin. I've just come back from Berlin, and I must say, I met on the streets people who speak German. You wouldn't believe it. Not everybody speaks Hebrew in Berlin. And there are more Germans leaving Germany than Israelis leaving Israel. Okay? So, again, there is what the journalists tell you, and there is Israel. And the two are not related. You need to look at the picture of what Israelis say about themselves, and also how they behave on the basis of this understanding. Now, here is another thing about the Israeli society that I consider very positive, and I'm sure this will be considered extremely politically incorrect to you. One of the best things about the Israeli society is that Israelis stopped believing in peace. And that's a great thing. Because, there will be no peace. And don't misunderstand me, agreements with Egypt of the kind we've had are the greatest achievement Israel has had ever. But it has nothing whatsoever to do with peace, in the sense of leaving Israel alone. Okay? There is much more hostility in Egypt today than it used to be. And as far as I'm concerned, the agreement with Egypt is good enough. But when it comes to the Palestinians, since Israelis used to believe that peace is possible, you have this attitude, and about 70% of the Israelis say so, that for peace, for true peace, they are willing to leave the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Okay? This was the attitude that was very prominent in Israel. Now, as long as, now I'm bringing in my political convictions, as long as you would only withdraw from these territories in return for peace, we will be stuck there forever. Because peace will not come. So, the disbelief in peace, and still 70% are willing to partition the land, means that finally might wise up and mutatis mutandis do in the West Bank what we've done in the Gaza Strip. In other words, unilaterally. To me, this is one of the best signs of the Israeli people. Sticking to the idea that you need to leave the majority of the territories in the West Bank or in Judea and Samaria, even when you stop believing that peace is a realistic option. We can, if you want, and I will be delighted to discuss objectively Israeli democracy, Israeli economy, Israeli society, whatever you want. I think all the macro indications are extremely positive, with some micro problems that need to be dealt with, but the macro indicators are very good. But the most important thing is the willingness of Israelis to adopt an attitude that I will characterize now and then end my remarks and open the floor for questions and comments. The basic approach, I think, of mainstream Israelis is the following. We live in a very hostile and violent area. Peace is not a real option. From time to time, wars will erupt, but we have a good life. This is where we want to raise our children. You have an enormously high number of children in non-ultra-Orthodox Israeli families. We're speaking about very close to 3 children per family among non-ultra-Orthodox families. This is a good life, and from time to time, there is war. So, in the United States, you have mudslides and earthquakes and tornadoes, and we have radical Arabs that from time to time make war. Okay? It's just one of those things. It's cold in the winter and it's hot in the summer. And from time to time, now we are giving wars a number. We had the second Lebanon war. I don't think any Israeli will think that there will not be a third and a fourth and a fifth, because this is the Middle East. And Israelis ask themselves, if this is the way Arabs treat each other, how would they treat us if they could? Okay? And I think that this attitude is a very healthy attitude. And to conclude, let me tell you a joke. And it's not a funny one. But the rest of the lecture you'll forget, the joke you'll remember, so I think it will have a lasting effect on you. The story is about God Almighty being sick and tired of the human race and deciding to bring a flood. But this time, comme il faut, wie es sich gehört, the real flood, no Noah, no ark, no, just flood. And he calls the leaders of the 3 monotheistic religions and says, go to your people and tell them that in 2 weeks it's over. So the Christian comes to his community and he says, guys, we've sinned. Let us pray, let us do good deeds for 2 weeks. Maybe they let us through the pearly gates. The Muslim comes to his community and he says, we've been perfect so far, let's be perfect for 2 more weeks, everything will be fine. And the Jew comes to his people and he says, guys, we have 2 weeks to learn how to live underwater. It is a different paradigm, and I think that this, in terms of net assessment, is the most important statement.
Thank you. Dan left us with a very optimistic forecast of the future, but I'm sure with many questions to ask, so I'm opening the floor to you.
And please challenge us. I'm a very aggressive person and I'm looking for an excuse.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Well, you mentioned that Israel has a defense against missiles. And I'm sort of curious, because one of the reports in the paper is that these rockets that were just captured in the Red Sea were ones that Israel does not currently have a defense against. And second, if one looks at the massive number of rockets that Hamas has, I wasn't aware that the Israeli defense could handle a massive wave of those rockets. I mean,
radical Arab enemies that we have about 175,000 rockets and missiles. A few hundreds of them have a good guidance system and a heavy enough warhead to make us seriously worried. Now, we have 3 layers, and now we're developing the 4th layer of missile defense. The short-range missiles have Iron Dome. Above it, we have the David Sling, or it's sometimes called other names, for a higher altitudes. Then we have the Arrow 1 and the Arrow 2 in the atmosphere, and now we're developing a more sophisticated one that will deal with higher layers of the atmosphere and will also deal with maneuverable missiles and perhaps multi-warhead missiles and so on. This is not a perfect defense, but Israel took in the Second Lebanon War, I think something like 4,000 missiles, and in the wars with Gaza also a few hundreds here and a few thousands there, and it's unpleasant, but it's not a real danger. Okay? The missiles that are a real danger are relatively few. They will become much more many, but they will increase in numbers, increase in range, increase in accuracy, increase in warheads. It's a given. But in the final analysis, there is no operative answer to the missiles and rockets, because no matter how good we are, and we are the best there is, still they will be able to continue and fire rockets against Israel. And therefore, you need a strategic response beyond the operative response that you cannot get. And the strategic response is the destruction of the country from which these missiles are sent. And in the Second Lebanon War in Beirut, we had a minor demonstration of what we can do if we are pushed too far. Now, here's the interesting paradox. The more sophisticated, more heavier and better guided missiles Hezbollah has, the more they realize that the Israeli response will be of the kind that they cannot afford. And therefore, the more they have, the more they're deterred. Now, does it mean that there will be no war? No, there will be war. Okay? Because they will miscalculate one day, as they miscalculated in 2006. Arabs have always miscalculated with wars against Israel, with the exception of the 73 war, which was designed to bring about the kind of settlement that from an Israeli point of view was very positive. Okay? So will they again miscalculate? Yes. Will it bring casualties in Israel? Yes. So it's one of those things. If you live in Oklahoma, it's the Twister. And if you live in Tel Aviv, it's the Schueftan. Okay?
Oklahoma doesn't have a reactor. This is a problem. Nuclear reactor, we've been hit even by a single rocket.
It's very easy to defend one particular point. It's very easy. And also, I'm delighted to say that I don't know what is happening in Dimona. I'm sure they're making kreplach, but I am sure that somebody already thought of how to defend it from the kind of missile that is coming. You can defend it, okay? It can be fortified to a position where it will not create it. And anyhow, defending one, if you are looking to defend one point, you can do it with 100% certainty. You cannot do it about the whole country, but you can do it about one point.
Jeffrey.
Yeah, I'm writing a book about East Germany and the West German left's antagonism to Israel from the 1960s to the 1980s. So I was interested in what you said about 35 to 40% of the Germans think that Israel conducts a Vernichtungskrieg. As you know, this was a key theme of communist propaganda for decades.
Yes.
And so I wonder how much of that 35 to 40% comes from people who live in the eastern part of the country. I wanted to ask a question about the '73 war and today. All the things you said about the United Nations were true in 1973.
Right.
What was also true in 1973 was that the Israeli government learned that in a crisis it has one ally in the world, which, as you know much better than I, was clear when the United States was attempting to resupply Israel with weapons, and the Brandt government didn't want us to use bases there, and none of the European governments would let the United States
Except Salazar
in the Azores, yes. And had it not been for Richard Nixon, Israel might have lost that war and would have been destroyed. Maybe.
No.
No? All right. Well, you're the military expert. At any rate, it was important. So this gets to the issue of how important the United States remains in 2014 as opposed to 1973 for Israel's survival. Because the same gut instinct about the survival of Israel is not, I think, present in the White House the way it was in 1973. So I'd like to hear your assessment about how the situation was extremely dangerous in 1973. Do you think it's not as dangerous today?
First of all, when the lecture is over, I'll give you my email. Let me know when your book is coming out. I'm eager to read it. I'm serious. It's a fascinating subject for me. I think I know the German situation quite well. I follow it quite closely, and I will be delighted to read
I think I'll write to you before the book comes out.
Very good. Very good. Because
We may have some things to talk about.
okay, I'd be delighted. It's a very important subject to research. Concerning the '73 war, we were never in existential danger. And, I was personally involved in the '73 war in trying to persuade the Egyptians to come to the Negev. Because the whole the point of departure of Anwar Sadat, and he didn't go to war before he changed the number of chiefs of staff and ministers of war in Egypt until he found those who understood what he said. That Egypt is structurally inferior and cannot, under any circumstances, challenge the Israeli strategic predominance. And therefore, what it needs to do is to find a small crack in time and space, a week for 15 kilometers, where it will challenge Israel, and the moment the Israelis get ready to destroy Egypt, then all he has to do is to say, Henry, and then Kissinger comes, and then he offers to Henry an offer that not only Henry cannot refuse, but even Golda cannot refuse, namely that Egypt moves from a Soviet sphere of influence to the American sphere of influence. And once Egypt moves to the American side, a major war with Israel is no longer possible. So what we tried to do is to tell him, come in, it's open, come to the Sinai, because then we could have the kind of war he was afraid of, namely where a modern state defeats a backward state in tank terrain of the middle of the Sinai. Because when he did it, and we succeeded one night between the 13th and the 14th of October, and he moved his tanks inside the Sinai Peninsula, we had one tank battle where he lost 264 tanks and we lost 6. This is the proportion of Israel in Egypt in 1973. We haven't learned anything new about the Egyptian capability in 1973 in terms of conducting a strategic war. Israel was never in danger. Now, say the Syrians would have taken Tiberias, okay? So Tiberias is taken, and it takes another week to kick them out. Is it pleasant? No. Is it threatening the existence of Israel? If I could make them come to Bnei Brak, I would even encourage them. You see? So
The bottom line is that the bottom line of this is that the Iranian threat is more serious than the 1973 threat. Is that what you're saying?
the Iranian threat is not serious in the sense that tomorrow the Iranians will throw a nuclear bomb on Israel. Okay? Because again, thank God we didn't listen to the Europeans, and the Iranians know what we can do to them if they do this to us. The Iranian threat is very serious for Israel and for the whole world, because the Egyptians will have to go nuclear, and the Turks will have to go nuclear, and if you leave any country in the Middle East alone, of the radical states like Syria and Libya, they will again embark on a nuclear project. And when in the craziest part of the world you have a multitude of nuclear nations, then other nations around the world, the Argentinians, the Brazilians, the Swedes, the Japanese, okay, who can do it, will do it. And then we'll live, and one day the Hugo Chavezes, okay, will get nuclear weapons. And it will create a world that will be very bad for Israel, and for the United States, and for everybody else, and for the Arabs, okay? So this is something that is tremendously different than the kind of threats. The threats we are facing are not bilateral. The problem is that when radical Arabs wrongly believe that they have an Iranian nuclear umbrella, they will embark on conventional provocations against Israel that will lead to war on a major scale. Okay? Our problem is not bilaterally with Iran, but what it will produce in the region, in addition to the very serious problems Iran is already producing in the region. Now, is the United States crucial for Israel? Among other things, and perhaps more important than even weapon supplies, in keeping the UN and Europe off our back. We would have been today in a situation of international sanctions were it not for the United States. But the difference between 73 and today is an additional one. In 73, Israel was not a weak country, but not a very strong country. Israel is today a country that nobody, including a misguided American administration, can afford to push into a war. Okay? Israel is today so strong. We have forgotten what happened to Israel in the last 60 years. In 1953, when the Americans told us, don't take water from the Jordan to water the Negev, and we hesitated for a day, they stopped bringing food to Israel and we had nothing to eat. So we had to capitulate to the Syrians. Today, no serious American president will try to push Israel too far. Now, can America constrain Israeli decisions? Yes. Should Israel listen to the United States? Yes. Should we do things that perhaps don't serve us immediately because it strengthens the position in the Middle East of the United States? Yes. Are we independent? Can we disregard what America is saying? Of course not. But it's a completely different relation than what happened in 1973. And one last comment. I wish I could hope for an American president as good as Richard Nixon in foreign policy. Okay? I think he was an excellent president in foreign policy. But the real question is not the American president. I think the real question is the support for Israel in the American people as reflected in Congress and as recognized by anybody who sits in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I think that our situation today is dramatically better. I wouldn't even compare it to 73. It's a different ballgame altogether.
Thank you. You raise your hand.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just attended APAC last week, and
So was I.
Yeah, no. And the feeling was that there's so much pressure on Israel now to do some kind of agreement with the Palestinians that there are a few things that are, like Netanyahu said, we have to have force between the West Bank and Jordan and the big we have to have force. But it seems the atmosphere that something is coming. That was my sense from APAC about coming to the peace with the Palestinians. What is your opinion?
First
about
of all,
that?
if I were AIPAC, I would be delighted that this was your sense, because this is what I would try to transmit. It's terrible about Iran and go lobby on Iran and the Palestinians. But basically, look what's happening with the Palestinians. Kerry has this Disneyland perception about peace between Israel and the Palestinians. This administration thinks that there is any relevance between the Palestinian issue and the Middle East. They really believe that if there is a settlement between Israel and the Palestinians, it will affect the Middle East. The Iranians will say, oh, there's peace between Israel and Palestinians, we don't need nuclear weapons. And the Egyptians will know how to feed themselves. And the Syrians will get together and sing Kumbaya. And the Turks will stop their counter-war. Nothing in the Middle East is affected by the Palestinians, zero. The effect of the Palestinian issue in the Middle East is zero, okay? And Kerry believes it's everything. And he needs some occupational therapy. Look, there is, what is happening in the Ukraine is tremendously important. What is happening in Egypt is by far 100,000 times more important. And he spends most of his time with Abbas using this word or that word on this or on that, because he believes that this is where he will, get success. Now, is it possible that he will get the paper he wants? Yes. What will be the significance of it? Zero. Okay? It has no importance. Now, is it important to urge Americans not to put pressure exclusively on Israel rather than on the Palestinians? Yes. Is it important to understand that this question of a Jewish state, as the Arab League said yesterday, is relevant to the right of return, namely the destruction of Israel by demographic means? Yes. Okay? It's not because Netanyahu wants to be called a Jewish state, because the Arabs say, and rightly so, that they insist on not recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, so that it can become an Arab state through the right of return. Okay? So, are these issues worth discussing? Yes. But in the large picture, you know what? If somebody could promise me that the existing state of Israeli position in the United States will remain, not improve, just remain what it is today, I'm buying. Okay? Even if there is an administration who made every possible mistake in the Middle East. Let me put it this way. If I were to be commissioned to write a book about what not to do in the Middle East, Obama will sue me for plagiarism. Okay? I can't think of a single move that was not misguided. And by the way, not on the Israeli-American level. I'm speaking on the American-Egyptian level, which is 100 times more important than the question of the relations with Israel. The relations with Israel are solid, are okay. Egypt may go hungry. The effect on the Middle East is enormous. So what are you playing around? Yes, cool, not to. They're the bad guys, and there's somewhat less bad guys. Okay? They're their sons of bitches and our sons of bitches. So you support your sons of bitches against their sons of bitches. This idea that the Muslim Brothers were elected democratically. Free elections doesn't mean democracy. In the Middle East, here is the strange thing. For every American, and rightly so, and for every Israeli, and rightly so, when you say a government reflecting the will of the people is a good thing. In the Gaza Strip, thanks to Condoleezza Rice, we have a government reflecting the will of the people. They really reflect the will of the people, Hamas. So, it is a calamity for the people in Gaza, it's a calamity for Arabs, it's a calamity for Israel, it's a calamity for the United States, but there is a government reflecting the will of the people, so what? This is not a democracy. So, the problem is not a Palestinian issue or an Iranian issue. The problem is that the administration has misperceptions concerning the Middle East, and they need to address them.
Dan, I'm sure that almost everybody will agree that the solution of the Israeli-Palestinian problem will not change a bit the other problems in the Middle East. But don't you think that the position of Israel will change dramatically in the world at large?
No.
Don't you think that the BDS movement will lose ground?
No.
Don't you think that many Europeans will not have the excuse to
No. Just a minute. I want to explain why no. Hey, there will not be an agreement, because the Palestinians have no motivation to reach an agreement. So there will not be an agreement. Second, I think getting out of the West Bank is important for Israel as a Zionist state. And I advocate unilateralism because the price of getting out is getting out. Okay? But in terms of Europe and some people in the United States, maybe even the president, it won't make a difference. I don't know if you've noticed that even the president, speaking to Jeffrey Goldberg, brought up how Israeli Arabs are mistreated in Israel. Trust me, they'll find new things, okay? The Europeans are already supporting in Israel everybody that tries to undermine the existence of the Jewish state in Israel. You know, since where Rabin stood, Israel moved towards European positions dramatically from Rabin, okay? Because the acceptance of the a Palestinian state that Rabin did not accept, the acceptance of the partitioning of Jerusalem by Ehud Barak, the 1967 boundaries by Ehud Olmert, a right-wing government speaking about the Palestinian state. This is dramatic movement. Europe got worse. The more Israel comes closer to Europe, Europe gets worse, because Europe gets worse independently. And again, here is the interesting thing, not in European governments. I will not give names because these were private meetings, but I recently met with the top echelon in Europe, in a number of major European governments, and in 4 out of the countries that I've visited, I've been told something very, very similar. We understand your analysis of the Middle East. We completely concur with it. And if we will pursue a policy that is reflecting this analysis, we will lose the legitimacy of our own educated elite. Because our educated elite wants us to have a different policy concerning the Middle East. The point is not that they're stupid. The point is not that they're hostile, the governments. The point is that they need to play to a European educated public opinion. And here is the interesting thing about it in Europe. Because Europe is being disregarded, it also becomes irresponsible because it knows nobody will do what they're suggesting anyhow. So there's a vicious circle between being unrealistic and being disregarded. Because, you know, here is a quotation, and if somebody will guess who said it, I will be really surprised. Power corrupts. Weakness corrupts absolutely. Who? American politics. Now I forgot his name. A very well-known liberal leader who was American, the American representative in the United Nations and ran for president. Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson. Power corrupts, weakness corrupts absolutely. Europe is corrupted by its weakness.
Go ahead.
As a committed dialoguer who aspires to structural realism, I'm going to probe the same issue from the geostrategic view that you gave. Now, you say that there's a coincidence of interest between the U.S., Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, most notably. There is also a demographic and geopolitical world in which Palestinians and Israelis live in a kind of entanglement west of the Jordan River that is unlike the west of the Middle East. So either through your kind of unilateral means or through the Disneyland negotiations as you characterize them, can you talk some about how there is a potential beneficial way of bringing this into that orbit, the Palestinian-Israeli situation?
Look, the only way is unilateral, because the Palestinians have no motivation to reach a settlement. Consider there are two options. Today, they are the darlings of the world. Everybody around the world gets up in the morning and asks, what about the Palestinians? They get billions of dollars. They live at the expense of others. And Israel is being undermined. Okay? If they establish a state, it will be a verschmutzte little state, a failure like all the other Arab states, corrupt like all the other Arab states. And nobody will even know that they exist, because the only reason people know that Palestinians exist is that they have Jews as enemies. Why, from all the peoples of the world, everybody knows about the Palestinians? Exclusively because you can blame the Jews, which is the most popular sport on earth for many, many years, okay?
Centuries.
If they settle it, they will lose all that. They have no motivation. There will be no agreement. No, they can sign the paper of Kerry, and we can sign it, and it has no significance whatsoever. So the only way is unilateral. And I can tell you what I would do if I were Netanyahu. I would approach Obama, and I would say the following. You want negotiations, you get off on negotiations, okay, negotiations, as long as you want. Do you mind if while we're negotiating, we will unilaterally dismantle the occupation by taking territories from Area C to Area B, and from Area B to Area A, with an objective to bring as much as possible territorial contiguity. And what we want from the United States is three things. First of all, keep the UN and Europe off our back. Second, don't stand in our way when we complete the fence, what they call here the wall, and incorporate in the fence, without you recognizing that it is Israel, the 6% that is Israeli settlement blocks, okay? And incorporates 80% of the Israeli settlers. And then the third condition is, don't tell us where to withdraw from. Leave that for the Israeli domestic political considerations. Okay? For instance, I would start with Yitzhak, with the Kahanist element, and one day before the evacuation, I'm going to steal an M16 from the army, give it to them with ammunition, and say, please shoot at an Israeli soldier. Okay? All I need is one case. I have the Israeli population with me. Okay? So you have to be tricky. No wonder I like Tricky Dick. You have to be tricky here. And then we could do it regardless of the Palestinians. Now, when we had Salam Fayyad, I spoke to Salam, the only Palestinian who really understood that building the Palestinian society is more important than all our considerations put together, okay? And no wonder he did not represent the Palestinians. But with Salam Fayyad, my suggestion to him was coordinated or parallel unilateralism. Namely, you do your shtick, we do our shtick, okay? And in time, you dismantle it. Now,
You just mentioned
you dismantle the occupation.
I
Now,
see.
do I still keep the Israeli army in? Yes. The reason being that if I take it out and there is major terrorism, we will have to reoccupy the West Bank and then we're stuck there forever. So, I want a good substitute for the Israeli army. You ask me, there's only one good substitute, the Jordanian army. The Jordanians don't want it. But the next 5 years, we need anyhow, in order to root out between 70 to 100,000 Israelis. Okay? This is a long process. Taking the Israeli army out, I can do in 2 weeks. Okay? But the process of rooting out the Israelis is difficult. What I would do with the settlers, I would say the following. Anybody who has a house or an apartment in the areas that we are evacuating, we will build for you a house or an apartment in the Galilee, in the Negev, or in the settlement blocks, wherever you want. And the moment you get the key to your apartment, a bulldozer goes to your previous house and erases it, so that another settler cannot come in. Okay? This will prevent what we've seen in the Gaza Strip. People who were rooted out and until today have no permanent housing. So and this way, you can persuade, my guess would be between 40 and 50% of the settlers beyond the line that we want to incorporate in Israel. And the others will be very difficult, but possible. But if you do it unilaterally, namely, you maintain your control, you don't depend on the goodwill of the Palestinians, you don't depend on anybody else, it can be done. Is it easy? No. But again, the impact on the Middle East will be zero. The impact in Europe will be zero. The Europeans will only focus on what the Palestinians will not be satisfied with. Okay? And I would leave Jerusalem, that I want partitioned. I would leave Jerusalem last, okay? Because it's not a good idea to bring together, and I would pretend that I'm not going to Jerusalem, okay? But I would do it in Jerusalem as well in the final analysis. And I think it can work, but this is an Israeli-Israeli issue, not an Israeli-Arab issue. It will have no effect, either in the Middle East or in Europe.
We have time for just one more question, so let's take one of the students, please.
Hi. You asked for Kelly, and I guess I find it so incomprehensible how you think that it's sustainable to live with, a war here, rockets there, hostility everywhere, and how you think that that's a sustainable model for the future of Israel, for the future of the Zionist enterprise, which we all care about.
Well, there is a very simple, logical maxim. If something is happening, it is a good proof that it can happen. This is exactly what we have for 140 years.
104, what was 104?
I'm starting, as you do, with the beginning of Zionism. When the first Zionists came, they knew about Arab hostility. Some of them had fantasies about peace, love, and brotherhood, but many realized over time that this is not happening. And if you ask Israelis today, why is such a minute proportion of the Israelis leaving, and why do they feel so good about themselves when they know with absolute certainty that the next war in Lebanon is coming?
But what does their certainty mean in the face of more and more wars that you say are inevitable?
Again, you're trying to analyze it objectively, but I'm analyzing it subjectively, namely, how do people that have to make the decision, if they live in Israel and have children in Israel, how do they see it? And they will tell you, they are telling you, yes, we know that this is the Middle East, but we have a very good life here, and we want to continue to live here, and we want to raise our children here. Okay? Now, say this were not a good answer. What do you suggest? That Israel will change the Arab world? If Syrians treat each other the way they do today, where everybody butchers everybody, there are no good guys there, okay? You have different good individuals are good guys, but if you look at groups, at people who make political decisions, they're not good, no good guys there. They're all behaving in a barbaric way. So what do you suggest? That we come to the Syrians and we say, hey, treat each other better because otherwise Zionism doesn't have a rosy future? Will it persuade them? It doesn't. It's a given. The question is, you can say to yourself, how can people live when it's raining? And the answer is they take umbrellas. Not they speak to the cloud and say, please don't rain. Okay?
You really think that a war with another major Arab country or more is comparable to a tornado that comes every year? They're really just something you live with?
We've had it. I've been in 8 wars. Okay? We've had it. We've had these wars. And it's not a theoretical question. It can be answered by the question of how many people left Israel after the 73 war or the 67 war or the Lebanon war or the second Lebanon war. And the answer is, if you look at the long range, a minute number, which is less than the number of people who leave European countries that have no war. So, in terms of the only thing that counts, how do the people there see it? Let me put it to you this way. Maybe you will say to yourself, if you're eligible, I don't know, I will not make Aliyah because I don't want to live in such circumstances. Okay, fine. But most people who came to Israel, even when they came, not as great Zionists, most people from the Soviet Union did not come as great Zionists, the second wave, the large wave, the 1 million people. Most of them did not come, and the overwhelming majority of them stay in Israel, feel good in Israel. And you know, the criterion that for me is the most significant, Soviet Jews came with an average of less than 1 child per family. Today they have more than 2 in Israel. To me, this is the ultimate signal for hope. The reason people don't have children is no hope or being European, which is another problem. A continent that is committing suicide. And when you say that instead of having less than 1 child, I'm having more than 2 children, to me this is a sign of saying it's a good life. And if Israelis say so, why do you think that they will say otherwise? Let me even take it one step further. Today, the realization that peace is not coming is greater than before. And the rate of leaving Israel is smaller than before. How do you explain it? We're strange people. So you may not want to live in Israel, but the overwhelming majority of Israelis have a different attitude. And for me, that's enough.
Well, whether you agree with what he said, or you agree with only parts of what he said, or whether you do not agree at all of you know why he's such a popular lecturer. Many